Welcome. It's so nice to have you all here with us this evening. And I really am thrilled and excited to introduce you to Rabbi Geoff Mitelman. I'm going to give you his formal bio in just a minute, but Geoff and I were classmates at Hebrew Union College. We studied together in rabbinical school, and we actually were together our first year in Cincinnati and again our year in Israel. So it's been a while since we've had the opportunity to learn together. And, silver lining of this pandemic, it's really a pleasure to be able to learn with people who are all over the country, all over the world, and to invite them into our community to share their knowledge and expertise. And I think we are really in for a treat this evening. So Rabbi Geoff Mitelman is the founding director of Sinai and Synapses. It's an organization that bridges scientific and religious worlds and is being incubated at CLAL, the National Jewish Center for Learning and Leadership. His work has been supported by the John Templeton Foundation, Manuel J. Friedman Philanthropies, and the Lucius N. Littauer Foundation. And his writings about the intersection of religion and science have been published in the book 7 Days, Many Voices, and A Life of Meaning, as well as on the Huntington Post, Nautilus Orbiter, Science and Religion Today, the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, and My Jewish Learning. He's been an adjunct professor at the Hebrew Union College and the Academy for Jewish Religion, and is an internationally sought out teacher, presenter, and scholar in residence. He was ordained by Hebrew Union College, where he received the Cora Kahn Prize from the Cincinnati faculty for the most outstanding sermon delivery and oratory, and is an alumnus of Princeton University, where he received multiple prizes for outstanding scholarship in biblical and Judaic studies. He was selected to be a member of the first cohort of CLAU's prestigious Rabbis Without Borders Fellowship, a national program that seeks to position rabbis as American religious leaders and spiritual innovators who contribute Jewish wisdom to the American spiritual landscape. So really, as you can tell, this is Geoff is so well thought of and has really had an outstanding education and background. And we are so delighted, Geoff, to welcome you. Thank you for being here. I am going to spotlight you so that everyone can watch you and see you. But thank you for being here with us.
Thank you for having me. It's nice to be here. I wish I could be here in person. And, when you were talking about that we were in rabbinical school, that's now, our first year was almost 20 years ago now,
That's
which is
so crazy. I don't really know where that time went.
I know but you all are very blessed to have her as one of your rabbis here. And it's nice to be able to be here. I've been to Michigan a few times. My mother grew up there and my grandfather actually was a sports writer in Detroit in the 1930s. So I still tell stories about when he knew Hank Greenberg, which is, I think, before many of everyone's time here, but I still have tremendous love for Michigan through my mother and through my grandfather here. So it's nice to be able to be here with all of you. Hopefully wherever you are, you're nice and warm. But it's terrific to be able to share with you a little bit about the work that we're doing in terms of the interplay of science and religion. And the title of our conversation is, Has Science Replaced God? And as we're talking this evening, I would encourage you to be able to type questions in the chat. You can use the raise hand feature. I don't know if with the spotlight, if I can see you raise your hand, but if you do, maybe Ariana, you can unmute people if they've got questions as well. And as she just wrote, you can ask questions, so I'll be monitoring that as well, because throughout the evening, there are going to be some questions that I'm going to love to hear some responses for, and we'll have lots of ample time for Q&A. But I want to start by talking about why I think the interplay of science and religion is such an important and challenging and crucial issue in America today. Because the science and religion discussion isn't just about the science and religion discussion. As you've probably noticed, I don't know, maybe you've noticed that the public discourse right now is not very good. There's a lot of arguing and a lot of demonization on both sides. I've happened to have seen this a little bit. Maybe if you're online ever or talk to anyone, you notice that conversations tend to not be all that constructive. And in large part, that's because the public conversation has really turned information and ideology into identity. And so what has happened is that there are now kind of two sides. One side is viewed as generally scientific and educated and liberal, and the other side is viewed as religious and uneducated and conservative. And there's a belief that if you pick anything from either of those columns, you've got to buy everything in that column. And it's even better if you demonize the other side. And if you think back of 20, 30, 40 years ago, if you were talking to somebody about something that you may disagree with them about, it often started off with, that's interesting. Tell me, how did you come to that belief system? How did you come to support that policy? How come you identified as that religious tradition or in that community there? It was a very open, curious kind of conversation. But then things have changed, I would say, in the last 30 to 40 years or so, where it really became, no, you know what? I'm right. And then it became, I'm right, you're stupid. And then it became, I'm right, you're evil. And that's where we are at this point. And it's prevented any kind of conversation that's happening right now. And so when we're thinking about this interplay of science and religion, particularly in the Jewish community, at least I'm going to talk about being liberal, meaning more, I would say, religiously liberal, but often they conflate there a little bit. Certainly, Jews, and particularly in the more liberal branches of Judaism, tend to really value education, tend to really value science, which means that their view on religion tends to be a little bit complicated, because Jews will say, wait a second, I identify as somebody who is pro-vaccine, pro-mask. I'm going to follow the science. I like Anthony Fauci. And that's going to be where we're going to sort of identify ourselves, which means that we see people who identify as religious and saying, well, that's not the religion that I identify with. So if that's what religion is, I don't know if that's how I want to identify, but wait a second, I'm proud to be part of this Jewish community. I'm proud of Temple Israel. I'm proud of being who I am. So who am I here? So we're really struggling with questions in terms of personal identity. We're grappling with questions in terms of social conversations of us versus them. And I think that leads to a lot of problems in terms of global questions of, thinking everything from COVID-19 to climate change, where we have some significant questions that we've got to grapple with. And if we're sniping at each other, that prevents us from being able to actually address them. So when I say, has science replaced God, I'm going to put my cards on the table now, and I'm going to say the answer is no, science doesn't replace God. But we're going to talk about why that question even comes up and how that conversation plays itself out in our society today. So what we're going to do, I'm going to go back and forth between sharing my screen a little bit. When I do this, there's usually a PowerPoint, but it's not a particularly exciting PowerPoint, so I'm going to share just the little slides and then come off of sharing my screen. But we're going to be talking about 4 different ways in which the conversation about science and religion is happening in America right now. And there are going to be 4 levels of sophistication, 4 levels of how productive and valuable that conversation can be. And they're all going to start with the same first 3 letters. They're going to start with the letter C-O-N. And they're going to go from what I think is the least valuable up to what I think is the most valuable. And what I want to be able to do is we're going to look at each of these models. There are going to be 4 models. And as we're doing this, I want us to think about a couple of different questions. The first question is, when you hear that model, who comes to mind? And that could be somebody that you know. It could be a family member. It might be you yourself. It might be somebody that you see on television or read online or follow the news. So when you see this model, who comes to mind? Try to get a picture of that person if you can. The second question that I want us to think about is, what does that model do for that person? If somebody comes at this world with a worldview of, this is what my worldview is, and it's not the worldview that we ourselves believe or the worldview that we are part of, we tend to say, oh my God, how could they possibly believe that? And that tends to be the tenor that we use, when in fact we should be thinking of, what prompts them to believe that? How can I get myself into that person's shoes? I don't have to agree with them. I don't have to like them. But I need to be able to at least understand within their own worldview, within their own internal consistency, what prompts them to be able to accept that worldview. And the third question that we're going to think about is, why is that model problematic? Even if they do accept it, I think there are going to be problems with it. So we're going to look at these 4 models. Who do we think of? Why do they believe it? And why is it problematic? And so as we ask these questions, we'd love to be able to see responses in the chat. So the first model that we're going to look at here, and I just have to be able to start this here as a slideshow, is what we're going to call the conflict model. So the conflict model starts in with this idea of science is on one side, religion is on the other. If I accept one, I've got to reject the other. So if I have one, the other is totally useless. So it could be I am a deep scientist and I think religion is Narishkeit, or I am a deep, devout religious person and I have a lot of questions about the value or utility of science. So when you see this model, first question, you can type this in the chat. Who comes to mind? And again, this could be people that you know, could be people in the public square, it could be friends, it could be anything that you're thinking about. When you see this model, who comes to mind? And you can type that. Oh, I'm going to type that in the chat, and I'm going to go back there. I was trying to be able to see the chat. And oh, sorry, I thought I've used Zoom. I'm going to stop sharing here because hopefully you can see this and see what people say. And when this comes up, who comes to mind when we think about this? Or you can also unmute if you would like to unmute if you want to jump in as well.
I would say Darwin.
Darwin. I don't know who it actually says that. But so Darwin actually, we might think so. We think of evolution. Darwin himself studied to be in the clergy. Darwin actually understood that his theory of natural selection was going to raise some questions for religious people. He actually was quite devout. But there are people who accept Darwin now in Darwinian evolution who would reject religion. So I'm glad you brought that up. I want to hold that there. Somebody said Jehovah's Witnesses. That's an interesting question. I don't know enough about Jehovah's Witnesses other than the opposition to blood transfusions. So I don't know. But as somebody said here, this is an interesting piece of pro-lifers. So when you say pro-lifers, sometimes when this comes up, and it looks like Mitch, that was you who had said that there. When I present this, sometimes people say pro-lifers. Sometimes they will say Republicans is something that some people will say in that way. Some people will say evangelicals. Some will say fundamentalists, and they'll say all of those things together. And I say it's a lot more complicated than you might think. So let's unpack a little bit of that. So Mitch, could you unmute for just a minute and talk about when you brought that up of what prompted you to be able to list that as one of the people there?
Because science gives us a way where we can control whether or not somebody, a pregnancy goes to termination. And pro-lifers don't want to accept that science can do something. They just want natural things to occur.
So that's
the best way I can
say that again.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no. So there's a piece of that, and where I'm going to try to complicate that a little bit is that pro-lifers have used science to be able to try to discourage abortions, right? Of the laws of being able to say, look at this image of a 13-week-old fetus, right? Science created people to be able to do this in this kind of way. And in a lot of ways, I think it's not as much the science, but it's more of, I have a religious belief that life begins at conception. Now, that is something that is actually not a scientific question, right? Like that is not something to be able to say, my belief system is that life and human life starts at conception. That's a value question. And we can argue about do I agree with that statement or not? But I think what's challenging with pieces and with a lot of these conversations is that we're conflating the science and the values. And so being able to say, I am pro-choice, I am pro-life, and I think pro-life actually means up until, pro-healthcare and all, dealing with questions of climate change, right? Life is much more than just what happens inside a woman's uterus. That pro-life has both a scientific and a religious element of that. So one of the things that I'm assuming that when you mention pro-life, that this often comes up when people will sometimes say evangelical Christians, when they think about evangelical Christians. And I have to explain a little bit differently. I say, actually, when you say evangelical, do you mean fundamentalist? And for those of us who identify as Reform Jews or conservative Jews, or being a little bit more on the religiously liberal spectrum and maybe not interact with more right-wing Christians, that there's actually a difference between evangelical Christianity and fundamentalist Christianity. And I actually didn't know this distinction until about 6 or 7 years ago. So evangelical Christianity are people who accept Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior and want to be able to have people take Christianity seriously and deeply in their life. Fundamentalist Christians say the Bible is the literal inerrant word of God. There are many, many evangelical Christians who are not fundamentalist. I want to really emphasize that. There are a lot of evangelical Christians who are not fundamentalists. Fundamentalists are the people that we would think of if we're driving somewhere and we were to see a bumper sticker that says, the Bible says it, I believe it, that settles it, right? That's the end of it. The Bible is 6,000 years old. Evolution is a lie. That is actually a much smaller population than we might think. And so when we're thinking about people who are buying into that worldview of being able to say, I am somebody who is deeply religious and I reject science, that's the kind of person that we're thinking about. And for me, and I think I would, my guess is that for many of you, that's actually a very difficult worldview to be able to understand. Like, wait a second, why would you reject knowledge in this kind of way? And I'll ask you this question here, and you can raise your hand in this kind of way. Raise your hand if a deep understanding of Darwinian evolution is crucially important to your day-to-day life. And the answer is probably not so much, right? Darwinian evolution, maybe in terms of understanding of COVID-19, but right, really deeply understanding the way that Darwinian evolution works, that really doesn't impact you on a day-to-day basis. But here's another question. How important is it to you on a day-to-day basis that you get support from your religious community? How important is it that if somebody in your community dies, or somebody is sick, or somebody is born, somebody needs help, that you're going to get some help, that somebody's going to deliver some food, somebody's going to be able to be there for a Shiva minion, people are going to be able to at least visit them in some capacity in the hospital? That's something that probably matters much more deeply than whether Darwinian evolution is the way that humans came into existence right now. And so for fundamentalist Christians, there is a level of identity there that it doesn't cost them anything to be able to reject Darwinian evolution, but it costs them a tremendous amount to be able to say, you know what, maybe the Bible isn't the literal word of God. Because if that's what your community is accepting, if that's where your community is, there's a real risk of being able to raise your hand and saying, hold on a second, I actually think maybe evolution is the way that humans existed. Maybe the Garden of Eden is a metaphor. If you say that, you are out of that community. You have lost your social structure. You have lost your support system. So I think that's a big reason as to why a lot of fundamentalist Christians and more right-wing Christians accept that element, accept religion, and reject science. It's not because they don't like science. It's because what is much more important to them, it's a much bigger element of their identity to be able to be part of a religious community here. I want to flip to the other side of this and ask, to be able to say, of thinking of people that you know who accept science and reject religion. So when you think of the people, we've talked a little bit about this piece of it. When you think about people who are into the conflict model, accept science and reject religion. So when we think about people like that, who comes to mind? You can either type that in, or you can feel free to unmute if you want to chime in this kind of way.
Atheist.
So atheist. Is that Maxine? Is that you who just unmuted?
Yeah.
Yeah. So talk about that for a second.
Well, they just don't believe in religion at all. And science is the one for them.
So that's a great point. And this is another piece. So thank you for bringing that up, because that's definitely an element of that. And I'm going to tweak it a little bit, if that's okay. I just want to complicate it in a little of a difference between what we would call an atheist and an anti-theist. So an atheist is somebody who doesn't believe in God, and an anti-theist is someone who doesn't want there to be a God. So there are probably many more atheists than there are anti-theists. There's you may have heard of him, Neil deGrasse Tyson, who is the host of Cosmos. He directs the Hayden Planetarium and is a wonderful science communicator. He actually does not like being called an atheist, mainly because, as he said, I'm not a golfer. I don't get together with other non-golfers and talk about not golfing. Right? That's like the atheists don't get together and talk about not God, right? That's not what atheists do. Anti-theists are people who really want to say, I don't want there to be a God. I want religion to be totally demolished in this kind of way. And actually, there are people who they tend to be very, very vocal. And when people think about these people, and Maxine and others, if you may have been thinking about people like this, there are 4 people who are called the 4 horsemen of the atheist apocalypse, is what they've often been called. Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett, and Christopher Hitchens. Bill Maher is another one who you may have heard. He's another one he's a comedian who falls into that camp, although he's a comedian. He's not a scientist. He's not a philosopher. There's a guy named Jerry Coyne who's at the University of Chicago, also very much in that vocal camp. So those are very much people. And by the way, there are a decent number of Jews who fall into this camp also, right? There are many more Jews who are going to fall into this camp than are going to accept religion and reject science. More Jews are going to accept science and reject religion and identify as being an atheist here. So one question that I want to put up there is, what does that do for somebody? Why would somebody accept science and reject religion? What does that do for them? Why might that be a worldview that somebody would accept here?
In my hand? No.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yep.
I have a different question.
Okay.
Okay. And I will talk about myself in this case. Would someone ask me, do you believe in God or not God? My basic question is all how you define God. And that makes a big difference, I assume, not just to me, but to other people who ask how you define God. And that will depend whether I believe or don't believe. If you can at all just encompass it in that, everything in that question, yes or no.
And that's exactly almost immediately the next piece that I'm going to go to. That's a critical piece, because one of the reasons this model is problematic is that it creates straw man arguments. It creates one particular view of God that you either accept or reject, when in fact there are multiple different ways to be able to think about God, multiple different ways to talk about God. One way that I like to phrase it is, I don't like to ask, do you believe in God or not? Because that's a binary kind of question. A better question is, what do you believe about God? And that then opens up the conversation. What is it that you believe about God? How does God work in this world? That's a very different kind of question. That's why I also think that Science is not ever going to replace God because we are going to redefine God in a lot of ways. So thank you. That's a very key piece here. So I want to be able to share a little bit of what are some of the ways in which people want to buy into this model. There are a couple of different reasons. A sense of agency and free will and a separation from difficult childhood relationships. I think that's a very important piece of that I think a lot of people's reason as to why they accept science and reject religion. Sometimes it's because of accepting the science, and sometimes it's because of rejecting the religion. And often that was problematic or even traumatic ways in which religion was presented. I think at best simplistic and at worst deeply traumatizing. And so there's a very significant number of people who have left religion because of that. I think that's a large part of it. And I think another reason as to why a lot of people accept that element and want to accept science and reject religion is if it's push comes to shove about what do I want to understand about the world, I'm not going to listen to Bronze Age myths from 3,000 years ago. If I want to understand about the world, I'm going to understand science. Right? It's the phrase that's coming. We've been using for the last almost year of I'm going to follow the science, follow the science, follow the science. Meaning, when I need information about the world, I am going to turn to science and religion. Okay, that was nice, but it was something that I had in my childhood. And now if I want to understand the origins of the universe, the origins of humanity, I'm going to turn towards science in this kind of way. But there are a lot of problems with it. And I'm intentionally spending a lot of time on this model because this is the one that most people think about. And it's the one that is the hardest to sort of break away from. I think one of the reasons that this model is particularly problematic is a few reasons. One is referring to what we were just talking about, which is that it creates straw man arguments. So it's not the smartest theologians and the smartest scientists arguing and discussing these kinds of questions. It's the smartest scientists punching down to really, really bad theology and really, really bad views of religion and straw man arguments. And so it's not at the same level, or really good religious leaders or theologians totally misrepresenting and misunderstanding what the science, sometimes willfully and sometimes just because to be a scientist, you need a lot of expertise. They're not arguing at the same level. They're kind of arguing of the best argument of one against the worst of the other. I think the other reason that's particularly problematic is that it ends up being that when you play offense, someone else by definition plays defense. So if you are trying to be able to say, how do I understand this world? That's an opening kind of question that's more expansive. But if it's you're an idiot, that's not going to you're not going to respond well if somebody says, you are a demon who is destroying America right now. You're probably not going to say, you know what, you're right. I need to do some self-reflection. And on Yom Kippur, I'm going to beat my chest. Boy, thank you. Thank you for showing me how much of a demon I am to this world. That's not going to be an effective way to be able to do it. You're going to preach to the choir. And my favorite example of this, I'm going to share a short little video. One of the people that I referenced earlier, Richard Dawkins, who is an absolutely brilliant biologist. He wrote the book, The Selfish Gene. He wrote Unweaving the Rainbow. Absolutely brilliant expert on Darwinian evolution. Also wrote a book called The God Delusion. He is an outstanding scientist. He is an atrocious theologian. But he wrote a book called The God Delusion in 2006. And a few years after that, in 2010, he decided that he was going to have what he would call a reason rally in Washington, D.C., thinking that in America and to be able to solve problems both societally and politically, we need more reason in this world. So, show of hands. All you know is there's a thing called the Reason Rally that's advocating for more reason in our world, particularly in politics. Would you think that's a good thing? Raise your hand if you think that's if you think the reason would be most people raising their hands of like, if all I know that it's reason, I think reason is good, right? Better to be reasonable rather than unreasonable. So most people say like, oh yeah, of course I'm going to go to a reason rally. So Dawkins launched a reason rally, and I want to show you a little clip of when he talks about religion and talks particularly about Catholicism and Catholics. And I want you to imagine, and someone said define reason. I'm going to define science a little bit later. Define reason, that's part of the problem, right? Because reason, if it is becoming weaponized, and we don't know what Dawkins had his own definition of what reason is. What I would think of it is being able to be reasonable, being able to use evidence and argumentation. And you would think that, okay, if I disagree with you, then we're going to have a reasonable discussion and you are going to treat me reasonably. That's at least how I would expect it. And so I want you to imagine yourself as a Catholic, let's say a moderate Catholic who has mixed feelings about science. You don't feel hugely strongly one way or another. You're not pro-science, but you're definitely not anti-science, and not sure how you feel about evolution. And this biologist talks about, and he's going to talk about how reasonable it is, and you're curious as to what he's going to say. So this is, I want you to imagine yourself in that way, and I'm going to share a little clip of what Dawkins says to about Catholics to predominantly other atheists.
So when I meet somebody who claims to be religious, my first impulse is don't believe you. I don't believe you until you tell me, do you really believe, for example, if they say they're Catholic, do you really believe that when a priest blesses a wafer, it turns into the body of Christ? Are you seriously telling me you believe that? Are you seriously saying that wine turns into blood? Mock them, ridicule them. In public, don't fall for the convention that we're all too polite to talk about religion. Religion is not off the table. Religion is not off limits. Religion makes specific claims about the universe which need to be substantiated and need to be challenged and, if necessary, need to be ridiculed with contempt.
So if I was a mildly religious person, if I was a Catholic, and I was being told by a scientist that I should be mocked and ridiculed in public with contempt, I am going to have a very negative view of science. And so I think that's a huge part of this conflict model. It ends up being much more destructive than constructive. Now, there are a couple of lights, little glimmers of hope in there. One is that the number of people who actually believe in this model, if we were to watch the news or look online, we might think the number's 80, 90, 95% of Americans who believe in this model. It's actually only about 25%. And what's particularly interesting to me is that the number of evangelical Christians who accept this model is also about 25%. And what's really, really interesting to me is that the number of Jews, the percentage of Jews who accept this model is also about 25%. What's now really, really, really interesting to me is that if you are a conflicted evangelical, you're going to accept, whether it's religion or science, if you're a conflicted evangelical, you're going to, you could probably guess, accept religion over science. And the number there is about 3 out of 4. If you're a conflicted Jew, you're going to accept actually science over religion. And the number there is about 15 out of 16. So one line that we often like to say is that the challenge in the Jewish community is not getting Jews to accept science. The challenge is getting Jews accepting Judaism and being able to really understand what does Judaism have to say, because it's not about these claims that are about the universe. That's part of the problem, is that we're thinking about it in this way. The conflict model ends up being more distracting than anything else. It gets clicks, it gets advertising, it gets book deals, but it's in my mind almost totally and completely useless in terms of being able to have a constructive conversation. So I spent a lot of time on this model because there's a lot here, and happy to answer questions. But I want to pause just for a moment or two to hear if there are any thoughts or questions before we move to the next model up here.
May I?
Yes.
Yeah. My question is this: you said you refer to Judaism or accept Judaism as a religion. I don't see Judaism as religion as the same.
Yes, I think.
Can you hear me? You said
Yeah.
they would rather reject Judaism than reject science. Yes. If someone, and I'm not saying that, quote, I reject religion, but I don't see that religion and Judaism are one and the same.
I think that you bring up an interesting and important point. So thank you. Because when we think about the science and religion discussion, the word religion usually is viewed as predominantly American Protestant white Christianity. And Judaism is different than that. And so when we're thinking about science and religion, someone said, how can we define science? And science is much more complicated. And I'm going to give my definition of science in just a moment. But religion is much more different and much more nuanced. And that's the thing, is that nobody is religious. People identify with whatever their particular communal tradition and culture is. And Judaism is identity, it's peoplehood. It is an element of religion, but it is not just religion there as well. And I think thinking about the science and religion, it becomes much more complicated and nuanced when we think about it in terms of Judaism. So thank you. I want to move to the second model here, because I want to make sure that we can get through what we need to be able to get through. So we got through the conflict model, and for some reason this is not letting me do a slideshow here. There we go. So instead of the conflict model, the next level up is what we would call the concert model. The concert model is science and religion overlap. That if you understand religion and the Bible and the Torah correctly and effectively, it actually matches with what science has to say. So when you think of this model, you can type in the chat if you'd like, of who comes to mind when you think of this model here, of if you understand religion and the Torah correctly, it actually matches very nicely with what we would say mainstream science. So that's Big Bang cosmology, that's Darwin, that we can have both of those things together. So I'm going to just stop sharing here. So hopefully you've seen this. The story of creation. Yeah, Anita, can you share? Can you talk for a moment about that? Maybe I don't know if you may be on your phone. Maybe hard to unmute if you're here. But you mentioned I'll talk for a couple minutes unless you're able to unmute. But
I just had to get on a big screen.
Yep.
No, the idea of the creation story. First, there is food, then there are people. First, there is what we need to survive is created first. It's very logical, and it makes sense. And so they don't have to be mutually exclusive. And I think that's what sometimes I think we lose in the conversation, is you can have good science and good religion. Right.
And I think that's a key piece of being able to have good both of those things, right? Too often we have bad science and bad religion. And when you talk about the science of creation, this is also a model where what we might call creationists buy into. Intelligent design movement fits into here, because the intelligent design movement attempts, or at least claims to be scientific. They are not trying to be able to say, this is all Narishkeit. This is, there's a reason that the intelligent design movement is trying to teach it in public schools, because public schools is where science is being taught. So this is an element of where creation, they're trying to be able to fit that into that world to be able to hold both of those things. So people who are, I would say, like biblical creationists, intelligent design, absolutely that is a big element there in this kind of way. Any other thoughts as to who comes to mind when you think of this model? So I'll say for a messenger, I'm curious as to what you mean by that.
Well, I'm not sure if I understand what you're saying, but that science, the stories were creative, and the stories evolve because science evolves and it progresses and it can tell us a message. It's not any kind of tit for that. It's the big picture, many big pictures.
I think that's a very helpful way. Thank you. And trying to think through of what is the text trying to teach us, right? And so this leads to both why people buy into it and why it's also a little bit problematic here. So I'm going to highlight a couple of these different pieces, and this is where I'm going to give my definition of science for those who are interested. So the reason that I think a lot of people buy into it is that it allows them to hold both of those things together. They can hold their science and they can hold their religion, and they don't feel like they've got to reject it. They don't have to separate out their sense of identity. They'll be able to say, I can study the Torah, I can hold the Bible seriously, maybe even literally, and I can have my science as well. The problem is, and you actually just mentioned this a little bit, you alluded to this just now, Lorraine, this is that the way that I would define science is that science's job is to help us become progressively less wrong. Almost everything that we know about the world in the scientific community was wrong 500 years ago. Not because they were dumb, but because they didn't have the same tools or methodologies. And we actually see this in a lot of ways we're seeing this even in this last year of COVID, because there was information and everything from vaccines to public health recommendations where there were recommendations that were made in March of 2020 that a couple of months later said, nope, we should change this here. And it's not because they were lying to us, although sometimes there wasn't, but if you trust the public health officials, if they're changing their recommendations, it's not because they lied, it's because new information, new data came, new studies came. Oh, we didn't know this is how this happened. Oh, this is how this grew. Science's job is to help us become progressively less wrong, which means that the Bible can never actually ever prove anything. The Bible can only disprove. So one of my favorite stories of this is that if we were to take the Bible to be literally factually true, that everything happened that was written there, then the stories of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Sarah, Rebecca and Rachel and Leah, they would have lived about 3,000 years ago, about the year 2000 BCE, give or take. And there's a very famous story in Genesis of Abraham's servant Eliezer going to be able to get water and hoping to be able to find a kind woman to be able to be Isaac's wife. And Rebecca comes and she gives water to Eliezer, and she gives water also to his camels. So that's the story. There's a crux of the camels of a story that takes place about the year 2000 BCE, 1800 BCE. Problem is, about 10 years ago, people discovered that the camel came to that part of the world about 900 BCE, about 1,000 years too late. And so what often happens with biblical stories is that the Bible, science will often prove that we were incorrect. The archaeology will say, this didn't happen. We're seeing this, for example, of the Exodus, right? There are questions of, do we prove the Exodus? Do we not prove the Exodus? Well, we're not going to be able to prove the Exodus. The most that we would be able to do is actually potentially disprove the Exodus, which would be really, really difficult for a lot of people's theology to be able to say, wait a second, maybe this didn't actually literally happen if this is a model that you buy into. So part of the problem is that it forces a square peg into a round hole. And what often happens one group of people who often buys into this model, and Ariana, I'm sure you see this a lot, which is teenagers, particularly 11 and 12-year-olds who were taught growing up, these are the stories of the Bible. This is Noah's Ark. This is the Exodus. This is all these stories from the Torah at the same time as they're reading and studying in the Bible. And then they come to bar and bat mitzvah, and all of a sudden they said, wait a second, how can both of these things be true? And I'm also a little bit of a rebellious teenager, so I'm going to rebel against my parents and my religious leaders. And so now, well, I'm going to actually accept the science because that's where I am in the Jewish community. So now I'm going to reject religion. And so there's a lot of atheists who come in at 7th, 8th grade because there's not a more sophisticated way to think about the Torah and to think about Judaism here. And so this model of the concert model works nicely until there's actually a bump, until there's actually, when the rubber meets the road, then it becomes really, really problematic. And so the concert model works until it doesn't, and then it often collapses into the conflict model. I want to pause here before we go to the next level up. If there are any questions or thoughts or reactions before we go to the next level of sophistication here. And if not, that's totally fine, totally great. And we're gonna go to the third model here, which is, if I can get to this, I apologize for the technical issues here. We got the conflict model, the concert model. This is what we call the contrast model. The contrast model is science and religion live in separate spheres. Science deals with the question of how, religion deals with the question of why. It's a simpler way of what's often been described as, from Stephen Jay Gould, of the non-overlapping magisteria called Noma. They can live in their happy, separate worlds. For a lot of people, for Jews, it's often I can be a doctor 6 days a week and I can go to Shabbat services on Shabbat, and they can live in their happy separate spheres in this kind of way. So when you see this model, and by the way, this is the model that most Jews tend to buy into, maybe you. If this is a model that you buy into, who comes to mind? And you can either type this in or unmute yourself. But when you think about this contrast model, who comes to mind? I'm just going to stop sharing here. When you think of this model of the science and religion, they live in happy separate spheres, and there's a nice big wall between them. So this tends to be, I'll share here, this tends to be a model that a lot of people buy into, a lot in the Jewish community, and most people who are not necessarily dealing with these questions of science and religion on a day-to-day basis. Probably, my guess is, if this is a model that you buy into, it's because the interplay of science and religion is not a live issue for you on a day-to-day basis. It is for me. This is my full-time job. And it is for some evangelicals, for example. This is something that is a really live issue with them, particularly evangelicals who accept what we would call mainstream science. Somebody like Francis Collins, who's the head of the NIH, who's also a very, very devout Christian. And has been doing incredible work of being able to combat COVID. It's one because it works nicely because people can say they don't have to interact with each other. They don't have to be in conflict. They don't have to do the mental gymnastics. They're just being able to put them aside. And Mitch, you had said agnostics, of people who, right, they don't necessarily have to think that hard about, is there a God? Is there not a God? How do I define the God? Right? They can just sort of be agnostic about who or what God is and not have to worry about the challenges here in this kind of way. It's a very comfortable place to be for most people most of the time, and it works most of the time for most people. Problem is that we live in an intellectual climate. We don't live isolated. We live surrounded by the ideas that are floating around the air for us, and they don't change necessarily in a matter of months or months or weeks or years or even decades, usually over centuries. Because if I were to ask you in the year 1300, what is the center of the universe? The answer you would have probably given is the Earth. And I would say, yes, that's correct. How do you know that? And if you were really smart, you would have probably said Aristotle. And if you were less educated, you would probably say my rabbi or my priest, or I look up at the sky and the sun's moving around and I'm the center of the earth. It's very simple. That's what the answer is. And so in the 1300s, that's what we knew. But as the 14, 15, 1600s came in, we got Kepler, we got Galileo, we got Newton, and your Galileo and Copernicus, and this idea that maybe the Earth is not the center of the universe. That became a big theological issue there. It raised a lot of questions, and so this nice wall between science and religion doesn't really work so much. It might crumble. We also think about this that if I were to ask you in the 1800s, where did humanity come from? And the answer I would say is that, well, God made us this way. And then Darwin comes, and that creates actually some theological questions of, are we purely animals? Where does our soul live in? It creates a lot of theological issues. In fact, evangelical and generally right-wing Christianity arose as an anti-evolution perspective. And as evolution became more mainstream, they needed something to fight against. And so that's why there's been a sort of a plug and play of against a lot of different pieces there, still fighting against teaching evolution, but because it creates some big theological questions. And so religion, which had been for many, 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 many years, simply a source of truth with a big capital T. How do I know things? The answer was God, or the answer was religion. Science changed that. Science said, wait a second, we are going to help you, maybe not a capital T with an eternal truth like philosophy, changing truths as need be, but if I want information, I'm going to use science. I'm going to use the scientific method. And so religion has changed. So religion then shifted and said, okay, no, religion's actually about ethics, about being a good human being here. And I know for me growing up, I think for many of you as well, if you were taught that what Judaism was about being a good human being. And that's wonderful until I ask you, do you know somebody who is religious and not very ethical? The answer is of course. Do you know somebody who is ethical and not very religious? And the answer is of course. And so religion and ethics are not necessarily an overlap there. You can be a good human being without being religious. And so religion has actually changed to be able to talk about meaning. And this leads to the last way, and what I think is the most sophisticated and most productive way to think about this interplay of science and religion, which is what we would call, and I'm going to share this here, is what we would call the contact model. Because science and religion are ultimately human questions. If you were to ask a scientist, why are you studying this galaxy out here? They're going to talk about, I would bet you lots of money that the answer they're going to give you is, when I was 7, my mom gave me a telescope and I looked at it and I went, wow, look at that universe that we live in. And I wanted to understand my place in the universe here. And by the way that science advances is through scientists, through humans, through making mistakes and having conferences and doing peer review. And religion is also a human experience. And this is why I say religion and not faith or Judaism, but religion is a way to be able to help us understand, what does it mean to be human? What's my responsibility here? Religion comes from the Latin of religio, meaning to be connected with each other. How do I find some way that's supportive? But also human experience changes religion. If Temple Israel was to hire a rabbi 70 years ago, they would not have been able to hire Rabbi Gordon. Right? 70 years ago, that would not have happened 70 years ago. Human experiences and advances in gender equality and women's rights has changed what religion is. Questions about LGBTQ equality. Religion has changed what it says because there's a better understanding of what does it mean to be human. Racial justice has changed of what does it mean to be human. So when we talk about these kinds of questions of of what does it mean? What are the questions that we're grappling with? Like if you want to talk about questions of racial justice, how do we create a more just and equitable world? We can use religion. We can talk about the community organizing that religion has. We can also talk about questions of the values of everyone created in the image of God. There are all sorts of different ways you can think about this. And you can also use the science to be able to say, okay, what are going to be effective policies to be able to say what's going to actually achieve the goal that I want to be able to do. America was founded as a scientific experiment. Almost every one of the founding fathers was an amateur scientist in some way, because they recognized that we're going to make mistakes. And science is a way to be able to help correct for that. And so when we're thinking about what does it mean to be human, we're thinking about questions of compassion. We're thinking about questions of our world. We're thinking about questions of our interactions here. And we need wisdom from science to be able to do that. And we need wisdom from religion. And if we devolve into this conflict model of, no, you're stupid, no, I'm going to mock you in contempt, or being able to say, why should I mask up? Why should I listen to the scientists here? I'm going to just do whatever I want. That ends up actually, in my mind, destroying society and destroying ourselves. But being able to say, I want and need wisdom from every source that I can find, we're going to be able to become better human beings and to be able to create a better and more whole society. So I'm going to stop here. Because I know we're almost out of time, but I want to open this up for questions here, and to be able to respond to whatever has come up. I know I threw a lot out there, but I'm going to stop talking right now.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
I have a question. A question or comment. You are described when you said what a rabbi would have been accepted the same 20 years ago, 50 years ago. You are talking about a growing interpretation, a growing religion, or the interpretation adjusting, quote, to humanity, what's perception of humanity now. But when you talk, I have a very close friend who is an Orthodox Catholic, whatever you can. And when you talk about the same thing with Orthodox Jews, the religion for them is not a living, expanding religion. This is what it says in the Bible, and you take it literally. And I am not an attorney and not an expert of the Constitution, but I sometimes compare it to the Constitution and to the religion, perceiving it how it was related to the time when it was written, and how it should be applied to our days, to the life that has changed, into our understanding, quote, of humanity that has changed. So the question is, religion and religion, the growing religion that changes with time to interpret what it, using symbolically one thing or another, or taking it literally that is frozen in time of 2,000 years ago.
So,
and if I may add one more comment.
Yep.
To me, to some extent, if I were to separate religion and science, I would say religion is more in the emotional sphere, and science is more in the logical research area and so on.
So you bring up an important point, and I want to though nuance that slightly, because I don't think that it's Orthodox Jews or Orthodox Christians are frozen in time and we're evolving. Every religion, and America has this with any kind of legal system, there is and in science too, there is a dynamic tension between something that is, and I'm going to use this with a small c, conservative and liberal. And there's one tension of, I want to preserve what is here, and there's some that I want to be able to change it. And they're different elements of where that's going to be. And you want to have the right balance for where your community is. So I'm thinking about, for example, what's on, I think, a lot of people's minds right now of COVID vaccinations. On some level, we want to have the right mix of being conservative and being liberal, right? We don't want a bunch of vaccines that are going to have horrible side effects. I want to be super liberal and open on these vaccines because maybe they will help. No, we want to make sure that they go through FDA approval, that they're approved, that there's been a rigorous process, that they work, they're effective, right? We need those different pieces to be at least somewhat conservative in this kind of way. And at the same time, we need to be liberal enough that we can adapt and change and grow and make sure that enough vaccinations go to different people. Reform Judaism has a conservative element to it. There are pieces of this which Reform Judaism either hasn't changed or has changed very slowly. Reform Judaism moves faster than other religions. But there is a dynamic tension. It's not that it's frozen in time, and no religion and no system is ever frozen in time, but some move slower than others, and they draw that balance between conservatism and liberalism in different ways and in different places.
Yes, I understand, but sometimes the discrepancy is so large about interpreting the how to apply the concepts into reality. And I am a member of Temple Israel, but I am not categorizing this by temple reform or not reform, but just how do we interpret and how do we bring the reality into the concept that were developed thousands of years ago in a different world.
Right. And those are all human questions and human experiences and defined by the culture. And so I think it's one of the hard things to be able to do is to be able to put yourself in the mind of a very different culture. That can be very hard because we're so used to our own culture that with lots of things, it's like what I'm doing is correct. What everyone to the left of me, they're lazy, and everyone to the right of me is crazy. But I'm doing it exactly right? Whatever your particular safety levels are or religious observance, right? Where you are is the right way, and everyone thinks this way. What I'm doing is the right way, but everyone else, they're nuts that far to be that conservative, or wow, they are just way out there. They are so liberal. I can't even understand them.
Well, to me, it is not they are nuts or not, but they live in a different world than I do.
Yes,
For
right.
me, sometimes it is difficult to connect with that world. I know where they are coming from. I use the psychology to interpret that, where they are coming from, in which but sometimes I have a feel that they live in a cocoon. And for me, it is not easy, or for them, it is not easy for them to an Orthodox. I am a goy. I am an outsider.
Right, and thank you. I think one of the challenges that's happening is that in a lot of our conversations on politics, on religion, and everything, we are much more interested in being right than we are in being effective. And we like talking to the people that we agree with, and it's very, very hard to before you can even constructively engage with somebody you disagree with, you've got to understand them. And you're absolutely right that is a tremendous challenge. So thank you.
Thank you.
Oh,
Go ahead,
okay.
Daphne.
Go ahead, Deb.
Okay. I enjoyed very much your talk. I really did. I learned a lot. But I'm a scientist, or I was a scientist. So for me, science is simple. You have proofs, you have data, you have things substantiated. You can put your hands on it, and I believe in it. With religion, I accept Judaism, I accept my traditions, I accept the prayers. I love to sing, to say the Shema, but I have a problem with understanding what God is. This is my biggest problem. I don't deny what I don't understand. I respect people who believe. Maybe I'm even jealous. Maybe they found what it is for them. But for me, this is the biggest problem.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. And there's a book that I will recommend, not knowing you. I've known you now for 35 seconds, hearing your wonderful statement. So I don't want to. But there's a book by Rabbi Brad Artson, and I, oh boy, I'm blank, but it's a book on process theology. If you look up Rabbi Brad Artson, and this is very much how I identify theologically, which is what's called process theology. I don't accept God as a human being or even a person or anything like that.
No.
In the same way that science is not a final answer to anything, right? Science is the process by which we gain knowledge, right? We collect data and we have information, but there may be other information that adds to, or it always adds to whatever we know, but it may force us to rethink what we knew, right? If you have to be able to say, you can't just say, okay, here's my paper. You've got to be able to talk about, here's my methodology. Here were the things that I might have messed up. These are the other open questions that are happening. These are the pieces that other people are going to know more about. That there's an element of the process by which we gain knowledge. That's also a process by which we are in relationship with God. In the same way that you can use that of thinking about relationship with a loved one, right? There's data that you use to be able to see, is this relationship working or not? And if not, I've got to make a course correction here. And there are going to be missteps. That has helped me to be able to think of God in that kind of way.
Can you please spell the last name of this?
Yes,
Rabbi?
it's Artson.
I just put an
Oh,
Amazon
terrific.
link in the chat.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think there was a question that came up in chat, and I think maybe we'll do that question, then come towards a close. But Marilyn had said, don't you think most people are molded by their personal experience? If you're raised in a closed environment, be it scientific or religious, you may never have exposure or experience with other ways. And I think that's exactly right. And I think that we tend to like being liked. We tend to like being supported. We tend, and if you're a real contrarian, you probably have a nice group of people that you like being contrarian with. And so it's very easy. It's very easy to be in a cocoon, and it's extraordinarily difficult to be able to think outside of what your worldview is. And again, like, you don't know anything different than what you know, right? How you grew up. And the other thing that's also very challenging is that, at least this is what I would accept scientifically, which is that our brains are not designed to be able to help us find truth. Our brains are not designed, I would even say brains did not evolve to find truth. Our brains did not evolve to be able to have friendships. Our brains did not evolve for anything other than to help keep us alive. And if an accurate representation of the world was helpful, that would be an evolutionarily advantageous element. But if it's more advantageous for us to lie to ourselves, we're going to lie to ourselves. And so it becomes very, very hard. I think we can do it, but it is very, very hard to break out of our echo chambers. And I think that's why it's so important of being able to, in the words of somebody that I heard, is to be curious and not furious. And that's particularly difficult because anger is an exciting emotion, and it gets people rallied around, as we saw with Dawkins, of everyone laughing and saying, yes, those Catholics are terrible, let's get together and make fun of them. I wonder how many really serious Catholic theologians has Dawkins actually had. And I'm sure he's had some, but I don't think he's had all that many. I think he much more enjoys being able to take pot shots at religious leaders than actually trying to engage in these kinds of conversations. And I think that's something for on all of us of how do we allow ourselves to be expansive and to be able to think about new questions in new kinds of ways and engage with people that we might not have thought of otherwise.
Geoff, thank you so much for this presentation. I think it's given all of us a lot to think about in terms of this intersection of science and religion and our personal theologies. I'm actually, I sort of selfishly recorded this because I want to be able to share it with my husband, who he and I have some of these conversations regularly about the intersection of science and religion. So I hope that this is just the start of our conversations and your personal conversations in your home about what this looks like. But I so appreciate you beginning this conversation for us and sharing these different models and different ways of thinking as we approach this. So thank you all for being here tonight. And thank you to Rabbi Mitelman for talking to us and teaching us this evening.
Thank you very much. I'm also happy to stay on for a few more minutes for people. I know people are probably tired and after a long day, so I want to make sure people are able to go. But thank you, Rabbi Gordon, and thank you to everybody here for joining us this evening. And I'm happy to stick around for a few more minutes if there are other questions that come up.